In this lecture, we're going to go through the four fundamental steps of knowledge translation that was first identified in the CIHR definition. And the first step is to actually synthesize and to gather the information or the knowledge that is eventually to be translated. And so the first step here is to determine how to find, how to assess, and how to summarize that information. And so the uh, credible, valid information is assessed and gathered from the available literature. And this can take on a number of different forms. The primary sources are considered those that are the original research papers or case studies. So these are research articles that appear in scientific journals that report the outcome of an experiment or a particular type of unique case situation. And these are direct observation types of studies where the researchers will directly obtain information in the form of data from individual cases, so people or other types of research models used in the laboratory. The information in this case should be unbiased, and that it should be very objective and not subject to any sort of interpretation in terms of generating that information, obtaining that knowledge by the primary developers, which are the researchers. And so synthesizing this knowledge should be based upon the most currently available information, keeping in mind that classical studies also play a very important role in trying to understand what can be eventually translated to the end user. And this process is a critical first step because this first process will help to identify the gaps that exist. So although the information generated from original studies could be in existence, it might not be harnessed and translated to the end user. And so this is an important step. By gathering that information, evaluating that information, we'll be able to ask the questions and hopefully to some extent answer the questions on what do we know with respect to a particular type of clinical condition, as an example, and what don't we know about that clinical condition from the most objective pieces of information that are available. The next step, once that research is generated, is the dissemination. And dissemination is the process of sharing the findings of those primary research studies. And so the modalities that are used to disseminate that information vary. The original research papers are the primary original source in which the researchers will convey the outcomes of their experiment. So this is a very valid type of modality in which that new information generated by researchers are conveyed to others. Keeping in mind that original research papers, a single original research paper, is very situation specific to the manner in which that experiment was carried out and has a very limited scope. So one and only one research paper will not provide all of the critical information that can be harnessed effectively for a particular clinical condition, as an example, but it's the summary of many original research papers that can be used that will eventually help to shape clinical application. The literature review is a very important and very effective way to disseminate original research. It's important to note that the literature review in and of itself is not original, but what the literature review does is it compiles many original research papers and evaluates the current state of knowledge or research. And this can be considered somewhat subjective from the perspective of the individuals that are compiling the literature review as to what those individuals consider to be important to convey. Now, the literature review can be generated in a fairly objective way, and that objective way is the systematic review, and what the next bullet item will address is the meta-analysis. So the systematic review is a literature review, but is much more focused on generating a research question. And that research question will be answered not by collecting new information, but by collecting the information that's already been generated by the original research papers. And the systematic review is designed in such a way that it can be replicated. And so the systematic review will outline a very detailed and specific set of steps on determining which of those original research papers are included in that review. And the systematic review is often paired with a meta-analysis, and the meta-analysis is the step that is taken in which the actual reported numbers, the values in the data in those individual research papers are obtained, and a second level statistical analysis is carried out from the numerical values compiled from a number of research papers. And so by carrying out a meta-analysis, the researchers generating the meta-analysis will be able to identify if there are any unique patterns or trends that emerge from the large number of the original studies that were published. The third step here in eventually translating this knowledge is what's called knowledge exchange. And the first question that we ask here is who is doing the exchanging. So we have the primary data that have been generated by researchers that are communicated and disseminated as original research studies in professional journals, or those original research studies can be compiled into a literature review, a systematic review, or a meta-analysis. So the primary researchers are considered the first line generators of the new valid information. The primary researchers are the ones that are in the laboratory. They're the ones collecting data that are obtained from individual cases, which can include people or other types of research models. When we talk about translating the information into knowledge, we're talking about information that is harnessed and applied for some particular purpose, and those are harnessed by the knowledge users. So at that point, information is said to become knowledge, and this is a reciprocal process. Reciprocal process referring to the fact that the knowledge users will harness the information generated by the primary researchers, and the outcome of how that information is used can be fed back to the researchers that will consider that in the next steps in generating another round of new information, which is the outcome of the next round of research studies. And in knowledge translation, the biggest challenge is this link between primary researchers and the knowledge users. The primary researchers are generating the information. The knowledge users are equipped with understanding that information, but how can a more clear link be made between the two. And that is the biggest challenge when it comes to knowledge translation. Most recently, the process of knowledge translation has introduced the concept of a knowledge broker. And the knowledge broker refers to a person that acts as an intermediary, linking the researcher to the end user. An analogy here of the knowledge broker is a real estate broker. A real estate broker is a person that makes the link between a person selling a property and a person purchasing the property. So although the real estate broker doesn't own the property, they're not buying the property, but they serve as an intermediary in linking the seller with the buyer. And the same idea here is at play in that the knowledge broker is engaging in activities that would link the knowledge user with the information produced by the primary researchers in a much more effective and efficient manner. And the fourth step of knowledge translation refers to what's called ethically sound application of knowledge. And this is referring to the process of moving the primary information into action. And this infers that the original research study findings are going to be used in some manner in an ethical way to affect some sort of outcome for the end user. And this is referred to, and this is what I call influencing the 3 P's. And those 3 P's are policy, procedure, and practice. And any organization, whether it's a private physiotherapy clinic, whether it's a sports organization or a hospital, all are governed by certain policies and procedures, which are ways that are clearly documented steps to carry out the policies, but also have what's called practice. And practices refer to those ways of conducting business that do not necessarily have a clearly defined set of steps and is usually passed on from person to person in a traditional sort of manner. And so the way that new information can be translated to the end user will be guided by institutional decision making. And so to understand what can influence knowledge translation within an organization so that it can benefit the end user, we have to ask the question as to why and how do institutions, whether it's a clinic, a hospital, or a sports organization, makes those sorts of decisions? Well, there are certain financial and legal considerations that institutions are bound by in order to carry out their operations. There are social norms which will dictate whether an organization will be successful in delivering certain sorts of services to their client base. And there are ethical principles that will guide that institutional decision making as well. And when we talk about ethical principles, there are 3 core fundamental ethical principles typically applied to research, but these are 3 ethical principles that can be applied to any sort of operation or organization. And these 3 principles include what's called the respect for persons, and understanding that an individual person is not an inanimate object, but must be respected with respect to their fundamental human rights and decision-making abilities. Beneficence refers to the aspect of delivering a service or research that will have some sort of benefit either to the end user or to the or to society or to that field as a whole. And justice refers to fair treatment of every individual involved with that organization, particularly the end users. So this ends this lecture on the 4 steps of knowledge translation.